Welcome to Reuters Events Pharma Insights, the podcast all about pharma. I'm Jonathan Elliott, your host for this episode. At Reuters Events Pharma USA in Philadelphia recently, I had a conversation that I found both passionate and precise, a combination that's rarer than you might think in this industry. I was talking to Dicla Veliz Salce, Breast Cancer Executive Director at AstraZeneca. Dicla brings something quite distinctive to the pharma world. She trained as a physician. She has spent time in the clinic, and she's built a commercial career around the conviction that you cannot market a therapy effectively unless you have genuinely stood in the room and seen what a patient and a multidisciplinary team are actually going through. We talked about how to make sure that an understanding of unmet need is real rather than assumed, and about the dangerous gap between what companies learn from market research and what's actually happening in the clinic. We got into what it means to design launch education that genuinely fits the workflow of oncology teams, rather than adding another layer of complexity to already overstretched professionals. And we discussed the evidence question. Why Phase 3 data alone is rarely enough to change prescribing behaviour, and how real-world evidence and partnership with investigators can fill the gaps that even the best clinical trials leave behind. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us in the podcast today. It's been really wonderful to have you on the show, and thanks very much. So, when preparing to launch a new oncology therapy, how can companies ensure that their understanding of unmet need genuinely reflects what oncologists and patients experience in the clinic, rather than assumptions made internally during development?
You are touching such an important area, because in the pharma industry, we are focused in our product for all the time of the clinical development program. Looking outside sometimes is difficult for us. The way that I try to ensure that we bring the external perspective, especially from marketing, because we are the ones responsible to bring the customer perspective to the conversations with the development teams. And this is why we need to be in the clinic. We need to speak with doctors, speak with patients. Market research sometimes is not enough to understand the needs of these patients. Sometimes we ask the questions that we want to hear, but not the reality. So for me, it's important to have this immersion in the clinic and take 1 or 2 days just looking what happened in the clinic when they are treating patients with early breast cancer, for example, to understand what are the questions that the patient is answering, what are the tests that the doctor requests, what are the challenges that the nurse is facing when she's explaining to the patient what is the treatment that this patient needs. So I know that at the end, we are here to sell products. This is a business, but bringing the perspective of patients, physicians, multidisciplinary teams is critical. Otherwise, we will not reach these patients when the product is available.
Absolutely. Oncology care is increasingly multidisciplinary and time-pressured. How can launch teams design education like data dissemination and support tools so that they actually fit the workflow of oncologists and care teams, rather than adding just another layer of complexity?
Yes, and you are right. In fact, working in early breast cancer, for example, I see that the oncologist is not the only one making decisions, because this patient perhaps goes first to the surgeon. And if the surgeon decides to perform a surgery and that's it, perhaps I will not be able to treat these patients later on. So at the end, this topic of thinking about the ecosystem and not just one stakeholder, prescriber, is very important for us. And I think the best way to cover the needs of the multidisciplinary teams is by understanding the key decision points they have, the areas where they need support. In this way, I can focus on things that matter for them instead of adding burden to the multidisciplinary team. Sometimes we only think about my product and how I can increase prescriptions, but if I don't focus on the decisions that the teams are making and where are the gaps that they currently have, the capabilities where they need support, I will never be able to reach these patients.
Absolutely. Physicians often say that what they need at launch is not just efficacy data, but practical information about things like patient selection, sequencing, and real world use. How can companies structure their launch evidence packages to better support these day to day treatment decisions?
Well, this is one area where I think we have big gaps in the pharma industry because you are right. We mainly focus on bringing a product to market and having successful pivotal trials, but it's not enough to drive a behavioral shift, to change the prescribing behaviors. And I will think about early breast cancer, where doctors feel very comfortable with the current therapies and they don't see the need to add a CDK4/6 inhibitor to the current hormonal therapy because they underestimate the risk of recurrence. If I am not ready with real world evidence to demonstrate that patients are at risk, the doctor will never see the need to add a treatment to this patient. At the end, it's our responsibility to ensure that the doctors have the context where the treatment will be prescribed and the doctors can make better decisions. And it implies going beyond the phase 3 clinical trial to provide all the evidence. Sometimes it's not easy because you mentioned sequencing, for example, and sometimes we don't have all the answers. But by partnering with investigators who are curious about these questions, we can get to the answers very quickly in the life cycle of a product.
Absolutely. What are the most effective ways that we can incorporate patient experience in particular, such as, quality of life outcomes, treatment burden, access barriers into oncology launch planning so that the therapy truly addresses what matters to patients as well as clinicians?
Well, in Europe is almost, in some countries, we must include quality of life data. But it's not enough. I just heard in the panel that we have how my colleagues in other companies are bringing patients early to the conversation with the clinical development teams to fully understand what is going on with patients, what are the needs of these patients. Because you are right, at the end, they are the ones who will deal with this therapy for the next 3 years. And if they don't feel supported, if we don't address their needs, they will abandon treatment. And this is very sad, but it happens in the oncology space. And I don't think that we have done enough to support patients. It's one of the most difficult areas where we can drive a true change in the behavior, but I think we can do more than what we are doing today.
Wonderful. Okay, so just coming to our last question, really. Many launches still focus heavily on the first 12 months. How can pharmaceutical companies build longer-term partnerships with oncology communities so that support for physicians and patients evolves as real-world experience with the therapy grows?
It's another challenge of the pharma industry where our time to peak it could be even 6 months and we are just thinking about that. But you are touching also a really important topic, which is demonstrate that my product is effective in real life, not just in the clinical trial. In making alliances with groups of physicians who want to see what is the evidence in real world of the efficacy and safety of a treatment can help in the life cycle, in the uptake of a new drug. In fact, we know that the first adopters will change their prescription in the first 6 months, but we have later adopters that will take 2 or 3 years before they think about prescribing a new therapy. And this is where the real-world evidence is critical, where we can really demonstrate that the product is changing the outcomes for patients in the long term.
Fantastic. Dicla Veliz Salce, thank you so much for your insights today into this incredibly important area. And thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Dicla Veliz Salce there, Breast Cancer Executive Director at AstraZeneca, talking to me at the Reuters Events Pharma USA conference in Philadelphia, a truly clinician's perspective on what it takes to get oncology launches right, grounded in the realities of the clinic and the lives of patients. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your colleagues. The podcast can be found on all the usual platforms, and join us next time on Reuters Events Pharma Insights, where I'll be talking to Luis Briz, President of Professional Health at Nestlé Health Science, about what happens when food and pharma converge, why nutrition could be the most powerful medicine we have, and how direct-to-patient models are reshaping the way we think about access, adherence, and the future of the microbiome. I'll see you then.